Chapter 8. The Robin Who Showed the Way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or to consult elders about things. All she thought about the key was that if it was the key to the closed garden, and could she find out where the door was and perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls and what had happened to the old rose trees. It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places, and that something strange must have happened to it during the 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her, and she could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone because nobody would ever know where she was. But they would think the door was still locked and the key was still buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms, and having nothing whatever to do to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to working, and what was actually awakening was her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it, just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. In India, she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care much about anything. But in this place, she was beginning to care and want to do new things. Already she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was the baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the walk and looked over at the treetops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be so near it and not be able to get in. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would carry always it with her when she went about, so that if ever she should find the hidden door, she would be ready. Miss Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock, she said. It was pretty on the moor, and the birds getting up, and the rabbits scampering, and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart, and I did so enjoy myself." She was full of stories of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had got the baking and the washing all out of the way. She had even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. "I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the cottage smelt so nice, clean, hot, bacon, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our deacon said our cottage was good enough for a king." In the evening, they had all sat round the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes and had mended stockings. And Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India and who had been waited on all her life by native servants, until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. They did like to hear about you," said Martha. "They wanted to know all about your servants and the ship you came in. I couldn't tell 'em enough." Mary reflected a little. "I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out," she said, "so that you will have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers." "My word!" cried delighted Martha. "It would set 'em clean off their heads. Would they really do that, miss? It would be the same as a wild beast show like we heard they had in York once." "India is quite different from Yorkshire," said Mary, as she thought the matter over. "I never thought of that. Did Deacon and your mother like to hear you talk about me?" "Why, our Deacon's eyes nearly stared out of his head, they got so round," answered Martha. "But Mother, she was put out about you seeming to be all by yourself like. She said, 'Hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, nor no nurse?' And I said, 'No, he hasn't, though Miss Medlock says he will when he thinks of it. But she says he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years. I don't want a governess," said Mary. "But Mother says you ought to be learning your book by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you," she says. Now, Martha, you just think how you'd feel yourself in a big place like that, wandering all around alone and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up now." And I says that I would. Mary gave her a long, steady look. "You do cheer me up," she said. "I like to hear you talk." Presently Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands under her apron. "What does thee think?" she said, with a cheerful grin. "I brought thee a present." "A present?" exclaimed Mistress Mary. "How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present?" "A man was driving across the moor peddling," Martha explained, "and he stopped his cart at our house, and he had pots and pans and odds and ends, but Mother had no money to buy anything. And just as he was going away, our Elizabeth Ellen called out, 'Mother, he's got skipping ropes with red and blue handles.' And Mother, she calls out quite suddenly, 'Here, stop, mister, how much are they?' And he says, 'Tuppence.' And Mother, she begins fumbling in her pockets, and she says to me, 'Martha, thou's brought me thy wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take tuppence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope.' And she bought you one, and here it is." She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with a striped red and blue handle at each end. But Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. "What's it for?" she asked curiously. "For?" cried Martha. "Does the mean they've never got skipping ropes in India? For all they've got elephants and tigers and camels. This is what it's for. Just watch me." And she ran into the middle of the room, and taking a handle in each hand, began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair to stare at her, and the odd faces in the old portraits seemed to stare at her too, and wonder what on earth this common little cottager had the impudence to be doing under their very noses. But Martha did not even see them. The interest and curiosity in Mistress Mary's face delighted her, and she went on skipping and counted as she skipped until she had reached 100.